Hi, everyone. This is Yeri, and you are listening to Arcane Threads, interweaving philosophy, astrology, and ancient wisdom. Today's episode is on preserving ancient traditions with the guest speaker, Allen Pittman. Allen has a very interesting background with many accomplishments. He is an author of several books, has apprenticed with many wisdom teachers around the world in medicine, martial arts, and yoga. He has served as a bodyguard to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Ralph Nader, Andrew Young, and Deepak Chopra, in addition to many high lamas. He has also worked as a physical education teacher in a Waldorf school. Today, he'll be sharing some inspiration surrounding his protocol, Wisdom of the Body, which he has described as a practice rooted in innate movements that we are all born with. Alan, welcome to the show. I have great respect and admiration for the work that you do, and I think that in these unprecedented times, more people are in search of authentic healing traditions and modalities such as the ones that you teach. I would like to ask, what first drew you to martial arts, and how did that journey evolve for you over the years?
Yeah, that's an intense question, especially in light of astrology and healing and all that stuff. Okay, so well, you know, as an astrologer, that the first house of our life is the first 7 years. And what happens to us the first 7 years is often a defining series of events. And so when we look at a chart, when we look at that first 7 years, we're interested in not just about the planet and the constellation, but actually in the whodunit. What happened to the person while that planet and that constellation were working on them? And it was that question that provoked me to write this book that I've got in the hands of the publisher. Because what I discovered was if we knew what the question was, we would know what the answer was. And if the angels are supposed to be teaching us something, which is the whole point of astrology, then it would help if we knew what it was we were supposed to be learning.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a particular house and you're getting a hard time, or all hell breaks loose, or you're in grief or trauma or loss, then there's a real question about what is this all about? And so I got the treatment early. And what I mean by that is what most people experience in the first 7 years, I got in the first 3 days of birth. So I happen to think that if you have a traumatic birth, it affects the rest of the spin of your
Mm-hmm.
life. And as fate would have it, my blood type did not match my mother's. And so that meant that while she was pregnant with me at a certain stage in the embryonic process, her body would turn on me and try to kill me because my body would be treated as a disease and not as a child. So I was Rh positive, she was Rh negative. There's lots of theories about Rh.
Mm-hmm.
But what that meant is the birth was induced, and then they got me out and had to begin blood transfusions. So I had, according to my mother, I had 10 transfusions in 3 days, and I was put on ice and I died for an hour. And then my heart started again, and they pulled me back out. And I never cried or complained. I was put in an incubator for a month. And so I didn't have normal bonding protocols. And then they circumcised me without anesthesia and sent me home. And so my mother said I never cried, I never made any sound. So she was never sure if I was alive or dead. So she would come into my room at night and hold a piece of tissue in front of my nostrils to see if I was breathing because she couldn't be sure. Because most babies, they cry or they make sounds. And, you know, in some ways, a crying baby is the best thing a mother can hear because she knows where he is and what's happening, or she. So, at any rate, I had that kind of a birth. And I think it's telling in many ways. And so, around the age of 5 or 6, closing in on that first house in astrology, As that window was starting to close up and seal, which is also when we basically go through our change of teeth. At that time, I got interested in martial arts. And what I see is it was a sort of natural, instinctive response to feeling that somehow there was a threat in the environment. So I think my brain was just getting up to speed with my birth, you could say. And I got interested in martial arts and I started reading. And finally, when I was about 10, I started ordering books because that's what you did back then. You ordered them by
Mhm.
mail and they would come in the mailbox, which was a very great occasion. And I'm a reader, so I'm an intense reader. My house is full of books. I've sold one library and started another. Um, so because I'm such an intense reader, I started that as a kid, and it was about martial arts and things related to that. And then I took karate lessons and studied Aikido and Jiu-Jitsu and did all the things that a young man would do that would be propelled into that interest. And I also, because of that interest, got interested in medicine. And so I became a physical therapy tech and worked in a hospital while I was, as a young man, 17 to 18. And it was very intense. I worked with burn patients and all sorts of trauma and bullet wounds. And that was a sort of rite of passage for me. So the martial arts and the healing arts to me have always been allied. So it's not just a question of learning how to break things, it's also a question of learning how to fix things.
Mhm.
And someone said, well, you've sort of created an interesting business for yourself. And I laughed. I said, yeah, we break them and then we fix them. And they laughed. But the fact is that in Asia, if you study with a martial arts teacher, you usually end up studying medicine to some degree because
Right.
the traditions have always been deeply connected.
Mhm.
And also deeply connected to medicine, the further back you go in tradition, is astrology.
Mhm.
Because you would never pretend to know how to heal someone without knowing who they were. And only in modern times do we have all that separated out into separate compartments. You know,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's crazy. It's
yeah.
um I definitely agree that you can't really hope to heal someone by isolating the parts so much. Um, I wanted to ask you also, I know that you've trained under teachers from various traditions in addition to those in the East. What are the common threads that you have found across many cultures?
Okay, I would say what happens is this is really fascinating. If you look at architecture, you find that there are pyramids all over the world. And if you look at language, you find there are certain terms or phrases that are probably common all over the world. So the architecture of language and the architecture of buildings has a basic match. And the architecture of martial arts, because it's based on the human body, there are some similarities around the world. But cultures have specialties. And I found this interesting because the specialties seem to come out of the land. And by that, I mean this. If you live near the ocean and you're a seagoing people like the Hawaiians, then your spirits and your gods are often aquatic. There's shark gods, there's fish gods, you understand, there's tidal wave
Mhm.
gods, spirits. Uh, so the region that a culture evolves from, it flavors the evolution of its astrology and its approach to human beings. And so this fascinates me because it indicates that an art comes up out of the land of its birth and is oriented to that particular land. For instance, Europe didn't have corn, but North America, the North American continent, those native tribes, corn is the sacred grain. But in Europe, it wouldn't be corn, it would be barley. That would be the sacred ancient grain, or spelt in Central Europe. So they all have this idea of a central grain, but that grain will differ according to the region. Um, so you'll find there are common templates, but when it comes down to the specifics, it will be extremely regional. And
Mm.
so there's a generic common language like Greek medicine, for instance, in the old days was based on 4 elements, and Chinese medicine is based on 5 elements. So they're very close. They're actually very close in their basic structure. The medicine of India, the Vedic medicine, also uses a 5 element and, interestingly, a 3 element diagnosis system. Now, all of these basic structures are common to things like how the sun, moon, and stars are positioned, which goes back to astrology again. If we wanted to find a common language for everything around the world, we'd begin with the sun. Everyone sees it, everyone feels the warmth, it controls the crops, the food comes up, people eat the food, they like the sun, it makes them feel better, they know what it does, and so they begin to orient their lives around the seasons. So all cultures have a seasonal clock. They all have a growing season and a storing season. The foods vary according to region, but they follow the sun. So you could say that the evidence is in favor of the sun being the basis of tribal belief systems. And then behind that would be the spirits. Like they would say, well, the sun is obviously, to the mind of the ancient, everything was alive. And so the sun was not just a thing, it was a person, it was a being. And only now, at this point in our history, are the physicists beginning to realize that if something radiates an energy, it radiates an intelligence. Because energy, any kind of energy in physics, always has an intention. If it has an intention, it has to have a motive. And so, just at the fringe now of physics, they're beginning to realize we live in an intelligent universe, which is what the ancient peoples believed all along. They believed there was a spirit in everything. And so you were never alone and you were surrounded by beings everywhere you went. It was a completely living world in every way, shape, and form. And physics is coming around to that now. So our sun religion concept is sort of having a new birth. Everybody, even the scientists, God bless them, are starting to realize, hey, it's all alive. And we're interacting with it. It responds to us. We don't just respond to it, it responds back. But we've not been taught to notice that unless you take certain kinds of mind courses where you're taught the universe is intelligent and you can anticipate a response, like some of these old positive thinking formats that say if you want money, you've got to feel like you can get it, right? You've got to emanate, you have to emanate a signal. Because if you emanate a signal, your environment sends a signal back. You're always in communion with sun, moon, stars, trees, dogs, cats, people, uh, machines now, which is another thing. Machines have their own motive, as it were. So yeah, so what's the common thing? I would say something like a 4 or 5 element system. All cultures use the visible planets to orient. And of course, astrology evolved, so they added the so-called less visible, further out planets, right? But all cultures use the sun and the moon and the seasons and the planets to orient their lives because it's the basis of food production and also the basis of navigation overland, and particularly more necessary if you're seagoing or desert going. You have to go by star position because you have no landmarks. Um, So the stars have been with us a long time, and they're part of the universal navigation system that we have used for millennia. But they have become more and more psychologically evolved.
That,
So yeah, so that to me is kind of where you're asking what's the common thing. You could say that the most basic astrology is the common element of all world cultures.
mm, fascinating. It's interesting to me that astrology is not even something that people would readily notice that you knew so much about because you are known as a martial artist and you've been a bodyguard to these high profile people and religious figures. So how and when did astrology come into the picture for you? And how does the astrology and all of these other things like the yoga and the wisdom traditions, how do they all intersect for you on a spiritual level?
Okay, well, the first thing I studied was something called Bagua. And Bagua is a Chinese model of the universe using an eight-house system instead of a 12-house system of astrology. That eight-house system, to the ancient Chinese mind, is how heaven touches earth. And so it was quite easy to go from an eight-house system to astrology, which is a 12-house system. But the Bagua houses are their own, how would I say? They were interested in coordinating landscape with star. And so they were very interested in what's happening on Earth as a result of what was going on in the sky. It was sharply delineated to what's going on around here. That's why Bagua is connected to feng shui, house decoration, or where you bury somebody, or why you always want to be sure that the back gate is well oiled, because if it's not, you'll get a sore throat. There are all sorts of weird parallelisms and synchronicities involved in Bagua because they were interested in almost the psychological linkage between what you could see above and what you experienced here. And so they created a scaffold for how does the top and the bottom connect? How does earth and heaven connect? And Taoism is full of this idea that heaven is shining on earth and continually breathing down and creating phenomena. Okay. So they have this feeling, and we're in that, and we experience it. So the Chinese created Bagua as a phenomenological, or perhaps more easy to understand, a map of reality. And the first house of Bagua is the creative house, which goes with, of course, the sun. So if you have a house, the first thing you want to do is have light in the house and light around the house, or you get mold. So the sun became a big deal in Bagua. And so the entire at 1/8 of the Bagua octagon is dedicated to light and creativity. So I got into Bagua and I learned tactics related to light and creativity, which are connected to the pineal gland and, of course, to blinding someone by removing their eyes. So it's very literal, it's very guttural, it's very gross, but it's very true. And what
Mhm.
they found on a survival basis was the first thing that you could anticipate if you were protecting someone was a distraction. Because if you're a bodyguard and you're protecting a king or a priest or someone of standing, usually an attack begins with a distraction.
Mhm.
Person's eyes to go where the attack is not anticipated. So if the attack is on the right, you have to make them look left. This is all connected to where the light is. Make a noise on the left, make an explosion on the left, make a commotion on the left, and then the attack will be on the right. And so strategy became very involved with the eyes and with light and with where's the sun or where's the source of energy or where's the distraction or where's the obvious thing. And so Bagua connected to strategy, but Bagua connected to the sun, Bagua connected to light and interior decorating. And naturally, I learned the movements and had tactical teachers who were fierce. And that's a whole other story of getting smacked around and scrubbing floors. Okay. But then as you get older, you start thinking, well, what's behind all this? And my teacher, my Bagua teacher in Taiwan used to say, oh, you're smart. You're going to figure out all the theoretical stuff later, but we'll work on fighting for now. And so he left me maps and terminologies and abbreviated studies to continue after his death because he knew I would dig in. And eventually I did. And I actually have a teacher who is a Taoist priest who's about 96 now.
Wow.
So that has continued through my life. I started Bagua when I was 15 and I'm 66 now. So I've studied it a long time with a lot of different people for many reasons. And Xingyi, which is an infantry art, is an art that's based on the Chinese five element system, which is a medical system. So eventually, yes, I studied acupuncture and pulse diagnosis, and then that evolved into getting involved with Indian medicine and Arabic medicine because I wanted to get to the heart of pulse diagnosis. And they all have different ways to take people's pulses and interpret them. And all of these diagnostic techniques uh, cross over into astrology because they all had astrology. And all the old doctors originally had to learn astrology. They would never take your pulse without knowing when you were born and under what conditions. But over time, that
It
became,
reminds me of that quote by Hippocrates,
would tell me,
that no physician has a right to call himself a physician without a knowledge of astrology. I don't know if
yeah,
I'm hearing that, but something to that effect.
yeah, and it's very smart because basically the core of the ancient mind was who are you? They believed there was a person inside that was extremely unique, and the medicine had to be personal. So there was never one size fits all.
Mhm.
And one person's junk is another man's treasure. One person's poison is another person's remedy. And so this idea of how extremely personal an astrological chart was had a huge effect on how personal a medical diagnosis would be.
Mm.
And it's very much a modern concept that one medicine will fix the same sickness in different people.
Mhm.
That's a very modern idea. Like a person is a 1920 Model T with interchangeable parts, and you can just take a heart out and put a heart in. The ancient mind would recoil at that and think, you can't do that because no two hearts are alike. And there's a karma involved with the structure of the heart. So if you take one out and put it in someone else, you're making them responsible for another person's karma. And of course, this is not discussed. But we do
Mm.
have people who get heart transplants who suddenly they can't be a vegetarian anymore. They're longing for a cheeseburger. Uh, the genetics leaks in the ether body, the rhythmic memory, the energetic signature of the organ that's just slammed into another body cries out to be expressed. And so they have to then apply all these medicines to be sure there's no organ rejection. So the whole phenomenon of organ rejection kind of proves the astrology. It proves that people are not just all the same. They're extremely unique. And
Absolutely.
it's very interesting how far we've come from that in medicine. And it will link back. I mean, everything, the pendulum always goes back and forth, and people want more personal attention, and they're not happy with the medical system, and they realize a lot of medicines are placebo. and this is both organic and synthetic pharmaceutical. There's a lot of placebo on both sides. Um, there are other things at stake with medicine, but probably the biggest problem with medicine is it hasn't been evolved on the spiritual side. It's been treated as a chemistry set. And people who know the history of medicine can go back to post World War II and Rockefeller and the taking over of the medical system by the chemical combines.
Mm-hmm.
What would interest you and me is up until the 1940s, every physician had herbal medicine in his black bag. And he was taught pulse diagnosis or to diagnose through the handshake. They actually could diagnose by that's what they'd come in, they'd shake the person's hand, they'd immediately know their strength ratio and the level of health of the heart through the handshake.
Amazing.
Yeah. And this stuff was taken very seriously. And the Sorbonne, up until the 1940s, taught the four humor ancient Greek system in the medical school. So this, what we call medicine now, is all post 1940. That's how new all of this is. The
Mhm.
previous 3,000 years has been panned. And with it, the astrology.
I'm so glad you said that. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I want to just talk about your practice, speaking of medicine and healing and looking at a person as a whole being instead of the isolated parts, instead of this reductionist approach that we have now in allopathic medicine. You have pieced together a practice called wisdom of the body. Will you please
Yeah.
expound on what this means?
It means, well, first off, I heard one person say, what does he mean, wisdom of the body? Whose wisdom is this? And they thought I was trying to set up some sort of indoctrination structure. And the woman that said this was confronted by her husband, who said, he means the body has its own wisdom. And that's what I mean. So the wisdom of the body means that self acceptance is what is missing in the human health dynamic. And trauma and epiphany and conditioning as children and the ups and downs of life and all the things that mold and mash and split and form and reform and injure us and build us, all of this process that we have, that we go through, that makes us act the way we do, often never addresses the ghost in the machine, who we are. So we'll say, well, this happened to that person. They had a difficult childhood, and so they're a jackass or whatever, right? But we don't ever say, wait a minute, before all of that, there's someone present. And that someone has had something happen to them. And do they know who they are from the beginning? Because there's no school that says, okay, let's sit down and talk about who you are. Can you imagine that at the age of 6? Your teacher saying, okay, class, sit down. We're now going to discuss the secrets of who you are. No, we never got that. And so somewhere along the line, someone has to sit down with us. And a lot of times we have to sit down with us and say, who am I? And go from there. And that's the beginning of this self-acceptance. Now, in wisdom of the body, what I do is I put people face down on the floor on a clean towel and have them put their face in the towel and roll it back and forth and press on their cheeks and their lips and their nose and their forehead, because that's what a baby presses against its mother. Forehead, cheeks, lips, nose, and it is the face on the chest or the cheek or the breast of the mother or the father, and the smell that tells the baby is safe and is home. That's the beginning of physical education as am I safe? Where am I? And we experience that as pressure on our face and a smell in our nose. And we're navigating for the breast, but we're also navigating for the voice because we hear their voice even in the embryo. So I have the students listen while they're pressing on the floor with their forehead. I'll say, "What can you hear?" And they'll say, "I can hear the sand in my neck," because there's lots of mineral deposits in their neck. And I'll say, "That's a good start. Listen to my voice in the room and the echo on the walls." And I basically begin with the regressive period where you become a child and you're on the floor face down and you're moving for the first time. And usually this is where people begin to remember things from their childhood. So I use wisdom of the body to begin to open the memory channels up and to relieve tension in the place where tension is held more than anywhere else, in the face, the jaws, and the neck.
Wow. And do you combine this practice with astrology?
It can be combined, which means if I'm working with someone on their first house, first 7 years, I'll put them down. I'll have them do that first part of wisdom of the body. And
Mm.
that first 7 years is the one that deserves, in most charts, the most attention because it's so foundational. But, we have to allow for karma and realize that in a human life, people have incredible experiences sometimes in midlife, or their epiphany may not be till the end of their life, in which point the whole world opens to them. And so we don't know in a human life at what point a person is going to pass through the enlightenment gate. Everything is building, and I will use wisdom of the body if the client or student is serious enough to want to do that kind of work, because it involves lots of tears, lots of memories, lots of tears. And sometimes they regress back to a previous life and remember things that they don't think are connected to anything. It's the way memory works is fascinating, and you can see why the ancients, speaking of traditions and such, they really believed memory and soul were connected.
Mhm.
So when I do wisdom of the body, a lot of times people will remember where they hurt themselves as a child because they're doing floor movements. But what happens when they remember what happened to them as a child, sometimes they'll begin to get images of something unrelated. And then you begin to get something like a regression. Why do I see this person in a military uniform? Or why is that village on fire in my head? I've never seen a movie like that before. Uh, so sometimes they'll kick back to a regressive pattern with wisdom of the body. Originally, I just designed it to alleviate pain. I just had people get on the floor and do movements from infancy to standing up, the same stages we all had growing up, right? I just had people go through that to find out where their body was stuck. And they would find places where muscles were glued together or where they always had a problem. And I would say, well, okay, you always had a problem lifting your left leg, so there's something wrong with the left hip. Why don't you move that around a little bit and play with it? Well, I go to the gym and squat and I'm very strong, but it always hurts. And I would say, okay, why don't you just relax, point your toe in the air and make little circles, like Alexander technique or like Feldenkrais. Or I would just say, why don't you just play with the movement a little bit? Now, what's interesting is I wouldn't say you needed to do 3 sets of 25 circles to get your hip open. It's not conditioning. I would just say, why don't you move the leg around and see what feels good? And what amazed me is how people haven't given themselves permission to simply experience their body without an agenda.
Mm.
Everyone has an agenda. You should do this yoga posture. You should be this strong, or your body has to be this beautiful, or you have to have a body that's going in this way. And there's so many things with body image, and so many things with competition, and so many things with looking like you have sexual prowess from both genders, and so many nonsensical imaging and propaganda schemes from advertising Hollywood and all that. Okay. So when I just sat them down, I said, just put your leg in there and move it around, see what you get. And they'll say, oh, that really hurts. And I'll say, well, that's too bad. Then they'll start laughing. And I'll say, okay, now, why don't you move it a little more that way? Because you're laughing already. And they'll say, well, it hurts. And I'll say, well, move it a little more. Maybe it'll stop hurting. And then they'll say, well, hey, starting to feel better. And I'll just say, well, if you breathe, it will help, but you don't have to unless you want to. And they laugh again. And so you have to kind of friendly your way into the instincts of the body without a pushy agenda. And with wisdom of the body, that was the way I started with it, simply to relieve pain. And I didn't know it would go into anything deeper than that. But when their pain is relieved, then they start getting ideas about what's happened to them. It's like their psychology is freed up once their body is freed up. And that began to get my attention. And then I started talking to veterans and people with serious trauma. And then I began to think about my own birth trauma. So things got heavy after that. And eventually I had to say, and I've always got to bring it back to this because of who you are. I had to go back to, my God, that first house sure was packed with stuff for me. And I've had to go back and really study that and try to look at the details. And there's a method because we don't know how to remember things. And sometimes there's memory blocks. And you won't remove the block until you make attempts to remember each side of the block. So if I were taking someone through a trauma and they'd say, I can't remember anything between 8 and 10. I'd say, well, what about when you were 11? And we'd work on that. And then we work before the age of 8. And so working this side of 8 and this side of 10, it would start to clarify. You're like working with dominoes toward the center. And they start to get their memory back. And usually there's huge blocks or incredible trauma, stuff they'd absolutely forgotten about. Because the biggest traumas are blocked. They tend to have a memory block so that you can survive. The memory block serves you. You can get on with your life, right? But after 40 or so, you start to want to know what happened. It's
Right.
interesting to me that the older you get, the more interested in the past you get.
So true.
And a lot of people, as they pass the 40 mark and go into 50, 60, 70, they get more and more interested in their family history. And there's good reasons for that. And it's very therapeutic because you figure out, wow, great grandmother so and so, she had the Irish second sight. Now I know where I get my mystical streak. And, you read little bits about her and you feel a connection and it changes you.
Hmm.
This kind of stuff changes you. So I'm all about reviewing the past uh, to clarify the present. Yeah.
Makes total sense.
Yeah. So wisdom of the body is I can use it from two sides. One is just to make people feel better if they've got lots of scar tissue, but the other is if they want to try to remember, then it becomes that, which is, I have to say, it's pretty heavy. You have to be willing to do it because it's work. It's physical work. People sweat. They sweat and they cry, and it's a shakeup. It's
Hmm.
and I don't lay it on people unless they want to do it. I'm real big on people staying free because anything that's not done with full volition can't happen. So
Right.
I'm real snippy about that. I think people should only be encouraged to do what they're comfortable with because anything else elicits more resistance. So you can end up making things worse. So
Hmm.
I don't push too hard on it unless the person says, "Hey, if I have someone who's like a triple Scorpio and they're like, "Hey, I can take it," I'll say, "Well, okay, well we'll go. You're gonna go through a hard time. We're gonna put you through the grill." But
Hmm.
other people, if they don't have a super intense chart, I'll be much more mild about stuff. When I worked with children, if the parent had a problem with the child, the first thing I would do is do their chart.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that was for learning disabilities. That was for birth. If they thought they had a birth defect, or, it became very popular for all children to have ADHD for a while.
Hmm.
Boy, did the pharmacy companies make a mint
I
on that.
remember.
And they all had it. We all have it. Everybody's a nervous wreck. It's like, no,
It's
no.
the culture now. It's very distracting and scattered. I mean, it's ADHD culture. What do people expect?
I know. It's really crazy. And I would say, well, how much do you let this young child of yours run around? And they'd say, well, they don't go out a lot. And I'd say, okay, well, they need to be outside running around 6 hours a day. Uh, and they would look at me like, what? I say, oh yeah, this is a glandular animal being just this side of an orangutan, and they need to be running, running,
That's what
running,
kids
running.
do. That's what they used to do, what they're supposed to be able to do. And
Yeah.
teacher at that,
I
not sitting
remember.
there in front of a screen all day.
No, we've really packed it in pre and post COVID. We've really
Mhm.
created a different uh, warped sense of activity.
Along these lines, you've spoken about preserving traditional teachings. So, what do you think is at risk of being lost in modern times? And I understand that you have a project that's devoted to the preservation of all known wisdom traditions on the planet before they go extinct.
Yeah, and I know I like that project because it's so unassuming and small. But people have looked at me when I've said I want to do that, and their eyes will get big and they'll say, "That sounds like a big project." And I'll say, "Oh, it's a huge project." But if it doesn't get done, it's the equivalent of letting the library of the world just burn up.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, yeah, what do I think is going? Okay. Basically, it's something really simple that everybody can understand, and that is when a good teacher and a good student are working side by side, both of them are changed, but they have to have a medium of exchange. And that medium of exchange is an art or a science or a craft. So if you're a carpenter and you have an apprentice and you're teaching them carpentry, there's two things happening. One is the younger student is learning carpentry from the older master carpenter. But what is unseen is that they are working on each other in the relationship and changing each other because they're learning about each other while the art is being transferred. So, what that gets rid of often is things like ageism. Okay. And if you're studying from another culture, racism. And if you're studying from the standpoint of, say, a musician looking at watercolor, you're being trans artistic. You're comparing arts. And so you're becoming more universal in your approach to art. So in the relationship, and of course, I'm talking about a real teacher, not someone who's not the PE teacher filling in for the history teacher. Okay, I'm talking about someone who's got a whole tradition. So that's what's missing. Personal attention is part of that. So one teacher with 5 students or less, And then they're doing something practical, which means it's not a theoretical thing. They're learning how to work on a loom. They're learning how to carve in wood. They're learning how to make bows and arrows. They're learning how to wrestle. They're learning how to watercolor paint. They're learning how to hunt, even if it's just with a camera. They're learning how to cook in the kitchen with like a little old fashioned Italian grandmother who's saying, "We always did it this way. Get your hands." And in that process, they're learning a lot of different things, not just the art, but the personality, the disposition of the culture, the atmosphere. And these things normally are not transferred now. You notice when you put on the RV glasses, you don't have smell, you don't have taste, you don't have touch, you just have picture. It's 3D and it's very impressive. I don't know if you've ever put on VR glasses. You know, you can be flying around the Mount Everest in the air and feel like you're right there. It's a little scary because it's three-dimensional, but there's no smell, there's no texture, there's no feel of the wind. So there's still a lot of things missing in the process. You know, when you're with another person, their body has several auras, 7 to 12, depending on the tradition, maybe as many as 14 sheaths. So when you come into contact with someone, you're picking up their radiation by levels as you get closer and further away. And the hearts, they know that heart tissue, even isolated, as it comes together, it starts to beat together in the lab. You know that. So hearts will tend to synchronize as they come into proximity. That is actually a scientific phenomenon. And so when you're with the same teacher, you begin to log on heartbeats. And then the transmission of technique includes telepathy because you're now breathing and heart beating in alignment. So the telepathic telephone opens up. And so a teacher student relationship includes telepathy eventually. And so this is what happens in tradition too. It's not discussed, but because these are modern times, I have to discuss it
I
because,
have noticed that as a common thread in stories I've read and accounts I've read of different people from many different traditions. So this all makes sense, but I've never heard anyone just lay it out this way. It makes so much sense. And I find it's definitely something that if someone like you and all of those who are supporting your work and similar endeavors and similar types of attempts. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like all of these things are in danger of
yeah,
dying
we
out.
want technology to do it for us. And although, you know, it's nice seeing you on a screen, it's not as good as seeing you in person. And it's important for me to be clear about that,
Hmm.
that the screen is giving us something wonderful. We get to see the picture and we get to have this contact. It's still not a substitute for the actual encounter. And we have been either consciously or unconsciously taught that to do something on Zoom is as good as doing it in person. But there's so many things that emanate because we're beings of light. There's smells, there's emanations, there's infrared fields. I won't go into the innumerable, there's the spiritual beings that stand behind us, uh, and archangels, all the hierarchies that stand behind a human being. When one human being meets another, it's like two kingdoms meeting, two entire different worlds meeting. But we're not taught that that's the case. We're just taught we're only people and that this person is two-dimensional and I'm only two-dimensional and we just talk like meh, 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 and that's what it is. But when two people meet, it's like one world meeting another world. And if we have, whether we believe in subtle shades of electromagnetics from the scientific side, or we believe in angels and spirits, they're both deep, profound, subtle, and contain a myriad of data. and you only get it person to person, and technology can't carry it. So that's why I emphasize this relation where two people meet and one studies with the other.
Can you share a story about a teacher or elder who left a lasting imprint on your life?
Oh, sure. Probably, let's see, I would use, okay, one of my female teachers. Rose Lee was the daughter of a noble house in China who lost everything to the communists and ended up relocating in England. And she was a Chinese martial arts teacher of calligraphy, culture, and martial arts. And she was extremely skilled. And she was extremely strict and disciplined. And the first time I met her, I was about 18, I guess. And I walked up to her in the class. I had been provided with an introduction. And she turned on me, and she was very tiny. She was kind of a Yoda like figure. She turned on me and she put her back to the wall with her hands behind her and sat against the radiator. And she said, "What do you want out of me?" And I said, "Whatever you would like to teach me, I would like to learn." And she went, "Hmm." And she said, "Okay." And then she started telling me what I could learn and what she would teach me and what she would not teach me. Right there. She'd say, "You can learn this and you can learn that, but you can't learn this. You're not going to be here long enough. And I know who your teacher is." And she just maneuvered me exactly where she wanted me to be. And then I said, "Okay, fine, then I'll study that with you." And in her typical way, she said, "Very good. We can do that then." She always maintained a kind of imperial tone. And then after that, whenever I went to England, and I studied Bagua with her, by the way, whenever I went to England, I would look her up and study Bagua. And that went on from the age of about, from that moment when I was 16 or 17 till about the age when she passed away, which I think was when I was probably around the age of 40. So I knew her for that long.
Wow.
And she taught me lots of ways to move, and she taught me how to teach. Because watching how she taught people was extremely uh, illuminating. If we were all walking the circle, she would not pick anyone out and say, "You're doing that position wrong."
Mm.
She would just quietly say, "Some of us have difficulty with our ankles when we walk." And then everyone in the class would correct the movement without anyone being singled out.
Mm.
Or she would see someone who was always the clumsy one with her arm that was slightly wrong, and she would say, "There's always people that have difficulty with their arm," and then we would all know who it was, but no one would be named.
Mm-hmm.
And then that person would struggle with the position, and the rest of the class would let them. But no one was pointed out, no one was accused. Uh, anyway, so she taught me how to teach by being nice and by inferring and not by pointing things out, how to handle a group, how to pace a class. And also, she didn't put up with fools. Anyone that she didn't want, she would flatter them and tell them she didn't have anything that they really needed. And so they would leave thinking that that was true. So she knew how to get rid of people. She knew how to handle people, how to group manage. She had a great sense of humor. She was extremely charming and extremely lethal. And she never taught how to use it. She just taught perfect positions. But the other students had told me she'd thrown a few people out physically. So I knew that she was very capable and she could be very humorous. And she had an incredibly fascinating biography because, as far as I knew, she had been a Roman Catholic nun. And she was also, which was unfashionable in 1913, a lesbian. And so she had been a renegade Catholic, nun, lesbian, master of the martial arts from a noble house, extremely well educated, well trained. She had an encyclopedic mind. She could lecture about Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity. She loved religion. She loved philosophy. She was very devout about Christianity, but she would never throw her Taoism out. Very strong about certain Confucian ideas. I found her to just be a wonder.
Wow.
She was
Amazing.
just a wonder. I guess she was kind of like my crazy aunt, you know. And I still dream about her. All my good teachers, they'll come up to me in dreams and say, "You need to be working on blah blah." It's direct instruction. I still get it. I'm 66 years old. I dreamed about her probably 6 times this year already. She comes up, she says, "Work on this." Well, why don't you work on that? Or we'll be passing by in a dream in the airport and she'll say, I've often thought blah blah, and then she'll walk on. I meet people in my dreams in passing, like we're going somewhere in airport terminals or on roads or on country paths or something. So it's very interesting how we're touched by people. And the traditional ways of learning, one in one on one and one in a small group, are what develop these capacities that machinery can't give you.
So, how do you stay grounded amidst so many different roles that you have? You are a very academic and skilled person. I mean, you've been a teacher, a scholar, a healer, a protector. So what is the center point for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'm older now and I'm more aware of vulnerability and the world. It's very interesting what happens with age. It's a lot like what happens with martial arts. The more you study power, the more you realize you don't have any. And the more deadly the techniques you learn, the more vulnerable you realize you become. Because everything that you learn is mirrored back. And so as you get older, there's also that double-edged sword of what if I did this or what if I'd done that? And so you have to clarify the fact that you're the age you are and you are now in your eighth or 10th house and you're running out of time.
Hmm.
And so the way I ground the energy now, part of it is realizing where I am in my lifespan. And I look at my chart almost every day when I do my breathing exercises. I'll pull my chart out and I'll say, "Now, wait a minute, buddy. Before you go off on one of your schemes, let's just look at your time frame." And I'm thinking, 7, 8, 9, 10th. Uh-oh, I'm I'm around the ninth or 10th house now. It's like, okay, so what does that mean? Well, I can't go back, and I can't be that young man traveling around Asia on a shoestring. I'm not him anymore, and I'm not that middle-aged guy teaching preschoolers in the morning and then packing a 9 millimeter on the subway with the Dalai Lama. I'm not that guy anymore. And you look at the chapters of your life as like chapters in a book, in a very literal book, and you think, well, I did that, and I did that, and I'm not those things anymore
Hmm.
because there's a tendency to say that is what I am, or I need to still uphold that role. And you have to say, no, now you don't have any hair. And now you're older and you're not motivated by the same things. Okay. And because of that, you have to think about what is meaningful to you now and what can you do at this stage that you couldn't do then. I remember when my mother, who died at 87, said to me, because she would embarrass me in public when we would go out, she would ask people the most pointed questions and then confront them. And I would say, Mother, how can you do that? And she'd say, I'm old.
That's a good one.
What was funny is she would confront strangers. A mother would be correcting her child or being too strict or whatever. My mother would walk up and say, "What a beautiful little child! You I think that you should think about," and just strike up this incredibly strange conversation that was didactic. And the woman would look at my mother at first offended and then kind of melt because it was this old woman trying to be nice. And so she would be forgiven for being obtuse. So in some ways I can play that. I can just say, "Hey, I'm an old guy. So you have to forgive me now because my mind is going." And I can play into that role. So what you can do at different ages, there's a level of what you can get away with. Like if you're young and beautiful, certain things you can't say. If you're old and curmudgeonly, certain things you can say. Because it's role playing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when you look at a chart, when I look at someone's chart and I'm doing their life history, I'll say, well, now you can do this right now because later you're not going to be able to get away with it. And there's a lot of humor in that too. So for
Hmm.
me, I guess the bottom line is I get up in the morning and look at my chart and say, where am I in life? That's my grounding, is at what point in time am I? Because this is a time body and it's limited. And we have to get our heads wrapped around the fact that it's a very definite duration, beginning, end. So between the beginning, the birth, and the end, we've got stuff we can do. And
If, oh, I'm sorry.
if I meet somebody if I meet a 14-year-old kid, and I taught for years, I'll say, listen, if it's a boy especially, I'll say, listen, you realize that between now and the age of 25, you can make your body like Hercules because you're still growing and you can train like a maniac and recover in half the time of an adult because you've got growth hormone. And they'll look at me, I'll say, yeah, you could do some Olympic records. This is the time to do it. Do it before you're 25.
Mhm.
And I'll tell them that, and they'll get very inspired. And I'll say, after 25, that window will shut. And so the one thing, not just physiologically, but astrologically, I find is we have very definite windows in life when we have an opportunity to do something. And when the window passes, that's it. You don't get a retry. And as we're passing through those houses and gates, uh, in astrology, to me, they're very definite rooms of life. And so to center myself, I get up in the morning and, kick my own ass and say, look, you're not 30, you're not 40. How old are you again? Alan or Robert? I use both names in case there's people confused about that. And I'll say, God, I'm a grandfather. Okay. And I'll say, okay, your grandfather age. So what does that mean? Well, it means people will look at me in this way because that's what we forget is however we feel on the inside, we're looked at by others in a certain way. And we're playing a part. However, we may feel internally, externally, we have to sort of stand up on stage and play that part. And I'm just coming into my Yoda syndrome, where I'm the old master and, can get out my walking stick and say, shut up, get over there and do that, and be respected for that, you know. So there's role playing involved as far as being centered in your life. You look at your chart, see where you are in life, play that role out. Not that that's all you are, but that is the opportunity for that role.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's a very great reminder because I think that in today's world, too many young people are taking a lot of things for granted, and it's not their fault. It's a lot of the conditioning now. So, a reminder about the fragility of life, the shortness of life, to take advantage of the gifts we have while we have them. This
Oh, yeah.
certainly.
Oh,
Yes. If you had, this is my not my last question for you, but it's a very relevant question to what you've just said. So, if you could pass on only one teaching to your students or listeners, what would it be?
wow. Such loaded questions. And I reserve the right to regret these answers and wish to repeal them at a later date.
Sure, not holding you to anything. It's
I
But in
will
this moment, what would you say?
I will go to core issues, and I would say young people under the age of 25 should be having an extremely physical life and traveling. And I think youth is wasted in school. I think
Mm,
youth is a time of adventure, and theoretics should be minimal. The life should be physical and vigorous. And if they're a poet, let them be a musician or be on stage. And if they're a warrior, let them be training as firemen, policemen, rescue, go into the military or world adventurers. Work for, what do you call it? When you go in and help another country, volunteer. Um, and
um,
anyway, these volunteerisms that where young people go to other countries and help cultures and help war torn places and stuff. My point is that up to the age of 25, teenagers should never be in school, as far as I'm concerned. All teenagers should be out there in the world, active, traveling, doing, running around, screaming, running around, driving, hunting, being fashionable, going to parties. It should be the life. The accelerator should be on the floorboards, and they should be out there. It's the physical world. Get out there, not on the screen, not in a classroom.
heck yeah, that is a different perspective. I've never heard anyone say that.
Oh, my mother
It
said,
makes sense. I mean, that's
yeah, yeah,
we only have
because
one childhood and one youth to live.
yeah, your body's young, and so for me, you should have a physical life, as physical as you can make it, up until after 25, and hopefully continue that to the first Saturn return. And I'd say up to the age of 30, then your Saturn return, when you get that knock on the door of mortality, then it's time to get theoretical. And I would swear to you that the best place for a middle-aged person is the university. That's where the middle-aged people should go. They should study because they've done living and they want to ask questions. But that's when we work them like slaves and they have children. And so
Mm,
it's funny how economics has sort of dictated life patterns that haven't been organized to meet the needs of a human being. See, ideally, you should be, oh, I'd say, uh, here's a semi-ideal. I know karma comes in and juxtapositions all this. We'll come into that in a minute. But basically, paired up, married, have kids by the time you're 18, and traveling and working with children anywhere in the world, and having this incredible, rich, physical, intercultural education, or single, doing the same thing,
mhm.
or partner, same thing, or individual, same thing. What I'm pointing out is family should have never been an excuse to turn people into a wage slave.
Well said.
All right.
I could
Then
agree.
Then middle age, okay, middle age, okay. This is when we really want to capitalize and make them a wage slave. But this is when people are just growing thoughtful and often having to juggle careers with children. And that has been turned into a obstacle course. And I could go on and on about the problems of middle age and the fleecing of the human being of all energy in middle age so they can have nothing left at the end of the day but attitude and and a mind so numb that they can't read a book and so they'll turn on the TV and get their indoctrination. Uh, that's a tragedy, but it happened with the industrial age and uh, the mill, the creation of the mill and industry and the 9 to 5 job and the pulling of the father out of the home so that he
Mhm.
couldn't show his children what it was like to be an energized man. And then after that, the pulling of the woman out of the home because the economy mandated it. And that's an interesting dynamic too. So the children are latchkey kids and they don't see the parents when the parents are at their most beautiful and energetic. Uh, these are all entirely wrong paradigms that seeped into modern life due to machinery. There's a deception with all these labor saving devices, and Schumacher said it. And this is something people are not clear about. Oh, AI will take over and it'll be run by robots. The problem is, for every machine, there's got to be someone who can fix it. And usually, it takes more people to fix a machine than to make one. uh, which is really strange. There's a funny backfiring with all of this. And they'll say, but they've got to be skilled labor. And I'll say, well, that's a relative term, and an assembly line can be full of skilled labor. But you to be skilled labor, you only have to know that skill, not 1,000 skills. You know, if you're in a
Quite,
commercial,
quite ironic situation.
very ironic situation, and we're in it. And so when I see all this, obviously, I'd like to snap my fingers and say, this is how society should be, because I'm a very physiological person. And I think a lot of our problems are glandular, not psychological.
Mm.
Uh, Most children who think they have ADHD just simply need to run around another 3 or 4 hours. And they need to scream and swing on ropes into big open lakes and there's certain children that need high risk because that's their karma and their glandular system, and they need dangerous stuff. And the parents want to overprotect, and you've got little children out there who already know they're going to be a fireman or a soldier, and they're volatile, and you can't lock them up without them becoming psychologically unstable.
Right.
And then you have poets. You'll have, I've met 3-year-olds that were poets. I could walk into a glass shop and they would just look and not touch a thing and act like little tiny gentlemen. And then, there are others that would, burn the place down, same age. So you've got to be able to diagnose this. Astrology, again, what kind of child? Where are they born? Under what conditions? What are their stars? Who are they? Who is this strange little creature that walked into my life that acts like this? And you look at the chart and you begin to see who it is, you know, and it
Mm.
helps.
Mhm.
And that used to be the backbone of medical diagnosis and psychology was knowing when you were born because that's your tool set. And people can say that's a little simplistic, and it is, but it's a better start than most of the testing we have now. Astrology probably gives you a better cross referencing field of indications for the human personality. Even if you don't believe in it, it still, I think, gives you the best evaluative criteria. We need to be able to stand back and look at someone. So we can use a Cooter test or we can use this psychological test and that psychological test. Most of them simply will not have the nuances of an astrological chart.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have this question on the tip of my tongue. It's going back to an earlier topic, changing this topic a little bit back to where we were in the beginning. I was just wondering if you could share a formative moment or a lesson from your time as a bodyguard that still influences you today.
Okay. I would say um, on the bodyguard thing, I'll use this one and I'll tell you how it influences me. Uh, uh, on several occasions, I was the bodyguard for the Dalai Lama at Emory University, and I was in the gym early because he was coming to the gym to give a talk, and it was going to be recorded and all that. And they were setting up a Buddhist, uh, um, a kind of liaison staff between Drepung Monastery and Emory University. Drepung is sort of the Oxford of Tibet. And so this was very official, and I had to get there early. And at that time, the president, I think it was Bush Sr., because of China's political position as most favored nation status, would not provide security for the Dalai Lama. And so they asked me to create a staff for security. So I felt like I was under a lot of pressure. And so I created this staff. So we were there early. Uh, I I found as a bodyguard, one thing you always do is you go to the location a week before and find the weak points of the location and talk to the staff. And of course, you always ask if anyone's been hired recently because that's the way threats get in. But anyway, you were asking about the particular moment, but I was standing on the bleachers or on a scaffold next to the bleachers off the ground, about 15 feet up, maybe 10 feet up. And I was just looking it over, kind of lost in the thought of were the entrances and exits safe and how fast could people move from different positions? Because you're always thinking in terms of how fast you can get from one place to another, because the seconds count if there's an attack or any kind of emergency. So I was just kind of going through the area in my mind, and I felt someone tug on my pant leg. And I looked down, and it was the Dalai Lama. And he said, "Gimme." And I had this mala. They're like beads, right? Prayer beads. They're big ones. And so I took them off. I was shocked. I didn't know he was there. No one told me. He just snuck in there. And I gave them to him, and he did this long prayer. And I sat there looking down, and there's this holy man holding my beads, just praying and praying and praying. It was all in Tibetan, and really earnest. And I watched him do that. And then he did some kind of oracular changing with it and stuff. And then he looked at me and gave it back to me and said, "Okay." And I said, "Dujeche," which is thank you in Tibetan. And he disappeared. He walked away. And I thought, wait a minute, that was the Dalai Lama. He just gave me a personal blessing. And I was kind of stunned because I didn't even know he was there. And usually I knew everything about where everybody was, but he could be very sneaky when he wanted to be.
Love that.
There's a whole set of stories about that, by the way. But anyway, I was stunned. And ever since then, when I thought I was alone and kind of stuck with the situation and kind of overwhelmed, I remember him being right there at my feet, which is in India, it's interesting because the blessing comes through the feet.
Ah, yes.
You go up and touch the feet of the guru, only it was reversed. He was down at my feet.
And Pisces rules the feet, and that makes sense as well because it's a very spiritual sign.
Huge. This goes back to the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene washing his feet in the oil, the St. John's oil. what we call St. John's oil now, which is what do they call it? Oh, I'll have to remember the name. It's used for depressives actually, but Mary Magdalene bathed his feet in that oil and washed it with her hair. Remember, in the New Testament. What's interesting about that is that you can only be initiated by a superior. And so if Jesus was baptized, if he was anointed by Mary, it indicates that she was actually his superior.
Mm.
And that gets bypassed in the church. But you
Definitely.
only go through an anointment protocol by someone who's of a higher rank than you, and whatever that ritual is. So, anyway, that's a moment from me is that surprise prayer. Well,
So the lesson was, or just when you thought you had all bases covered, the Dalai Lama sprang up out of nowhere. I love that.
yeah, it suffers the double thing of being true. Yeah, yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, so I was fascinated to discover that you have this new astrology book. You did mention that earlier, but you didn't give away the title. I don't know if you want to mention, but it's
Well, it's
unlike any of the other books you've written. Do you want to share?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's under a working title. Intertraditions has it now, so I don't know if they'll change the title. The publisher always preserves the right, due to marketing to change the title and all that. The title right now is Trauma, Epiphany, and Astrology.
Wow.
And and it's not a highly complex astrological book. What it is it's a text to encourage people to look essentially at if they had a particular blessing in their life or a particular trauma, to simply look at when it happened and then to look at their astrology in light of that. Because you process more if you know who's in command. If a trauma happens to you when you've got Pluto in the house, I mean, that's death and transformation. You need to know that that is a deep, deep trauma that's supposed to change you completely.
Hmm.
And if you know that, then you understand the intensity and that you're not just imagining it. You understand that it was supposed to be that way. You understand what it was supposed to do to you. So, and if you had a time in your life when something ecstatic or extraordinary happened, again, like that moment with the Dalai Lama blessing my mala, I could trace that astrologically. I could see what house it was in and what the planets were
I'd
doing.
love to know if you'd like to share what that was.
I'd have to look it up. I'd have to look it
Okay.
up. I would have been in my 30s. So it would have been after my first Saturn return, I can tell you that. So it would be coming on the coattails of the first Saturn return. Um, but I'd have to look at the specifics. But this is the way I see the relevance of astrology to trauma and epiphany is it allows you to see what was the lesson I was supposed to learn. Because a lot of people, they just feel abused or they feel life is a roller coaster and they've just been knocked from one thing to another. And my point with the chart, and I know you know this, so I'm just kind of blathering, is is that it gives you the insight to know what the lesson was supposed to be. So you're not confused. Because we always double guess. Oh, maybe it should have been, well, I don't know, maybe it should have. We have a difficult time with acceptance
Hmm.
of ourself, but also of what we went through. Um, and sometimes we should really see clearly that whatever we have been through, we did pretty good by getting through it. Period. Put period there. You did good by getting through it and breathe. Permission to breathe. Okay. and then say, now let's look at that and see what was happening. And then you go deep on it and you ask the person, what did it feel like when you were going through it? And they'll say, my God, it felt blah, 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 blah. Tears, right? And then you look at the chart and you say, well, no wonder, because you've got Uranus coming in from this house, Pluto coming in from this house. This event was designed to just explode everything in you and make a new person and completely shock you into a new dimension. There was no getting around it. This is what the event was supposed to do. And then they say, well, I'm so relieved because in some ways you've de-traumatized the trauma by finding out what it was for. So, everything has a reason. The planets are not by chance marked by angels, as are the constellations. And right now, I'm actually doing a study. It may result in another book about the angels and time, because time has become a favorite subject of mine. Because traditionally, angels are present at different times of the day. So in the old days, you would pray to different angels according to the time, because they change with the position of the sun. And so,
Fascinating topic.
yeah, it's fascinating because it means someone is in the room who wasn't there an hour ago. And that means everything changes on the hour. And, Linnaeus, when he was doing his first nomenclature on naming the plants, he was one of the first people to notice that in the morning, certain flowers open on the hour. On the hour. Exactly on the hour they open, only when a certain constellation is at 12 o'clock. Directly overhead, the plant will open. So that means the plants are tuned in to the constellations. So there's your scientific verification of astrology. That's your first step. So we're living in a clock. Everything is on a time basis. And astrology, again, has fermented. I want to say it's vintaged like wine over the millennia to tell people that time is important and that we're not supposed to be the same. We change over time, the way a tree grows, the way a flower opens and shuts. We're a part of this whole fabric of time. Difference being, of course, that we also have a star body, which means when the body lays down, there's a part of us that doesn't disappear. So that's more obvious to people now than it used to be because we have all these accounts of near-death experiences.
Mhm.
So
Well, seems like a great place to conclude this talk, unless there's anything else that you'd like to share.
no, I mean, I feel like I blathered on plenty, but
Oh, it's been great. This has truly been a rich and inspiring conversation, and one that reminds us of the value of tradition and the discipline of self-mastery and the healing power of presence. So, Alan, I really thank you for sharing not only your incredible journey, but the wisdom and humility that come with it.
well, thanks for being here. And hopefully we'll talk